Bradbury's original story, Usher II, was written by, drumroll, Ray Bradbury as an homage of sorts to Mr. Poe, which makes it a great story for tonight. The prequel, the sequel, and the epilogue written by your narrator, me. So I do hope you enjoy. If you do enjoy, but you can't stick around for the follow-up at 9 p.m., you know what to do. It'll be on our YouTube channel in a day or two. Yeah, okay, that gets the spiely stuff out of the way, unless somebody said something to me in text chat that I didn't see. Well, I'll stick around for that if you do. Okay, where were we? Yes, next story. I'm almost there, really. Okay, ready? Yeah, go. So, Usher I, the prequel. The room smelled of dead summers and ancient dust, of leather bindings that had held back the dark for 100 years, and of the sweet vanilla decay of paper that had grown old in the company of ghosts. William Stendahl sat in the center of this paper universe, a small man huddled in a velvet chair that seemed to be swallowing him whole, much like our chairs here at the Seanchai Library tonight. Before him, the fireplace crackled with a dying energy. Each separate dying ember wrought its ghost across the spines of 50,000 dreams. He held the book, the Poe, with a grip that was less like a reader's and more like a lover's. It was a first edition, the leather worn to the smoothness of a river stone. Outside, the world was turning into a desert of the mind, a place where white porcelain tiles and stainless steel thoughts. But here, in this cellar, it was always autumn. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, Stendahl whispered the words aloud. He liked the way they tasted, thick and heavy like cask-aged port. Then the siren began. It wasn't a sound of nature. It was a sound of the new era, a high antiseptic shriek that pierced the cellar's brick and mortar. It was the sound of a vacuum cleaner designed to suck the soul out of a room. It was the Moral Climate Patrol, and they were 3 blocks away. Stendahl didn't move. He turned the page. He knew the Bureau of Internal Hygiene had been tracking his purchases for months, though his alias held firm. He had bought too much ink, too much paper, too much imagination. In a world of bright, functional suns, he was a man who preferred the sun, the moon. Let them come, he murmured to the shadow of a gargoyle perched atop a bookshelf. Let them bring their chemicals and their white-smocked men. They can burn the paper, but they have never figured out how to cauterize the memory. Not yet. He looked up at the stacks. There was Baum. There was Carroll. There was the dark, damp cellar breath of Lovecraft and the sharp autumn leaf crackle of Hawthorne. They were all there, standing in silent ranks like soldiers awaiting an execution. For 30 years, the Great Fire had been creeping across the world, a slow, methodical erasure of anything that didn't have a functional purpose or a statistical reality. Fantasy was a virus, the Bureau said. It made people unhappy by showing them worlds they couldn't inhabit. The siren grew louder, a physical pressure against his eardrums. It was at the curb now. Stendahl reached the final paragraph, and the deep, dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. He closed the book. The thud it made was the sound of a coffin lid shutting. Above him he heard the heavy rhythmic drum of the dismantlers. They didn't knock. They didn't have to. The door upstairs hissed open. Upon pneumatic hinges, he heard the boots, rubber-soled, silent, efficient, moving across his hardwood floors. They would be smelling the air, cataloging the filth of his library with their electronic noses. Stendahl stood up, his bones creaking in sympathy with the house. In his own skeletal rattle, he heard a ghostly echo of a night 40 years gone. A night of wind and wings, when he had bargained with a man made of soot and autumn leaves for the life of a friend. He had been skeleton then, dressed in white bones, learning the macabre wisdom of the dark from a master of the shadows. He had learned that mortality was the spice of life. Now he would become the architect of its revenge. He walked to the center of the room where a single candle burned in a silver holder. He looked at the flame, a small, defiant orange tongue in a world of fluorescent tubes. "Pikes!" he called out softly into the shadow of the north alcove. A man stepped forward, or rather a shadow stepped forward. Pikes was thin, his face a map of tragedies he had once acted out on celluloid before the film was melted down to make combs and toothbrush handles. He was a man made of grease paint and moonlight, now dressed in the drab gray coveralls of a janitor. "Here, Tom," Pikes said. His voice was a dry rustle of stage curtains. "I know," Stendahl said. He looked at the Poe in his hand. "Is the transport ready? The one we discussed?" "The rocket is fueled with more than just liquid oxygen," Pikes whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. "It is fueled with every reel of film I managed to bury in the desert. It is fueled with the things they think we've forgotten." The cellar door at the top of the stairs was kicked open. A flood of harsh white light spilled down the steps, bleaching the colors out of the book spines. A man stood there, framed in the brilliance. A man in a white suit with a silver badge that caught the light like a predator's eye. "William Thomas Stendahl?" the man called down. His voice was clean, sterilized, utterly devoid of music. "By the order of the Office of Mental Health and the Society for the Prevention of Fantasy, you are ordered to vacate these premises, Mr. Stendahl. Your collection has been deemed a Grade A narcotic. The incineration crew is standing by." Stendahl looked at the man, then down at the book. He leaned over and touched the corner of the Poe to the candle flame. The paper caught instantly in a bright, hungry yellow. "It's a dull, dark, and soundless day, officer," Stendahl said, his voice rising to meet the white light. "But I think I'm going to make it a very bright one." He tossed the burning book into the center of the room. As the fire began to leap toward the shelves of 50,000 dreams, Stendahl turned to Pikes. "Pack the shadows," Stendahl said. "We're going to Mars." The men in white did not move like men. They moved like a series of coordinated reflexes. There were 12 of them, a clean, silent dozen, and they brought out with them the smell of ozone and hospital corridors. They carried long, silver-nozzled hoses that connected tanks of liquid fire, a chemical compound that didn't just burn paper but seemed to eat the very memory of the ink. "Step back, Mrs. Stendahl," the lead investigator said. His name was Garrett, a man whose face was as smooth and unexpressive as a peeled egg. He checked a gauge on his wrist. "The air quality is already dipping into the suboptimal range. You are breathing in stagnant thoughts. It's for your own health." Stendahl stood by the far wall, his hands shoved deep into the velvet pockets. Beside him, Pikes was a statue of repressed fury, his eyes reflecting the white fluorescent wands the crews had propped up around the room. "Health," Stendahl whispered. The word felt like a stone in his mouth. "You speak of health while you prepare a guillotine for the mind." Garrett didn't look up from his clipboard. "The Great Fire of 75 was a triumph of public hygiene, Mr. Stendahl. We eliminated the neurosis of 3 generations by removing the stimuli of fear and impossible hope. Why look at a painting of a dragon when you can look at a blueprint of a bridge? One is a lie, the other is a destination." "A bridge to nowhere," Stendahl said. "Begin," Garrett commanded. The hoses hissed. It wasn't a roar of a bonfire, it was a high-pitched predatory whistle. The first stream of chemical fire hit the north alcove, the section housing the 19th century romantics. Stendahl watched as Moby Dick blossomed into a flower of blue flame. The great white whale didn't go quietly. The leather binding shriveled like skin, the pages curling and blackening as if the sea itself were boiling. Then came the poets. Keats, Shelley, Byron. They didn't burn so much as they evaporated. Their verses, once heavy with the scent of nightingales and Grecian urns, became a gray, oily smoke that the ventilation fans struggled to pull away. The room began to scream. Just Stendahl, it wasn't the sound of burning paper, but a chorus of 50,000 voices crying out in terror and suddenly silenced. He saw the Wizard of Oz vanish in a puff of emerald-colored sparks. He saw Alice fall down a final fiery rabbit hole as her looking-glass shattered under the heat. "Look at them," Stendahl said, his voice trembling. "Look at what you're doing. You're killing the only things that ever made us more than just clever apes." Garrett stepped toward a shelf of Greek myths. He pulled the volume of the Odyssey from its place, weighed it in his hands as if it were a piece of contaminated meat, and tossed it into the center of the growing pyre. We're making you stable, Stendahl. A man who reads about Cyclops is a man who cannot appreciate the efficiency of a turbine. We are clearing the clutter. The heat in the cellar began to warp the air, making the rows of books look as though they were underwater. Stendahl felt a hot, dry wind whip past his face, the draft created by the incineration. It was a wind that smelled of burnt glue and lost civilizations. He watched a crewman approach the Gothic wing. This was the heart of the library. Here sat the heavy, shadow-drenched volumes of Le Fanu, the crumbling pulps of Lovecraft, and the complete works of Poe. Wait! Stendahl stepped forward, his hand outstretched. A crewman blocked his path with a silver-clad arm. Stay back, citizen. Chemical splash hazard. The nozzle opened. A jet of pale violet flame struck the shelf. The murderers in the Rue Morgue shivered and died. The pit and the pendulum was sliced in half by the heat. Stendahl felt a phantom pain in his own chest, as if the razor-edged pendulum of Poe's imagination had finally swung low enough to bite into his ribcage. Pikes! Stendahl hissed, not turning his head. Are you seeing this? Pikes was trembling. His thin actor's hands clutched so tight the knuckles were white. I'm seeing the final act, Tom. The curtain is coming down. And they've set the theater on fire. No, Stendahl said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. This isn't the final act. This is the prologue. They think they are cleaning the world, Pikes. They think they are making a tabula rasa, a blank slate. He looked at Garrett, who was now supervising the destruction of the children's section. Mother Goose was being fed into a portable shredder before being doused in accelerant. The bright illustrations of red apples and golden eggs were chewed into gray confetti. They want a blank slate, Stendahl continued, his eyes wide and fixed on the fire. But they forget that once you wipe the slate clean, you can write anything on it. You can write a nightmare. The incineration lasted for 4 hours. By the end, the cellar, once a cathedral of mahogany and gold leaf, was a tomb of white tile and gray ash. The books were gone. The shelves had been dismantled and hauled away in sterile bins. The very smell of the library had been replaced by the scent of bleach and industrial floor wax. Garrett stepped to the center of the empty room. He tapped his clipboard with a silver pen. Total reclamation, 51,402 units. The premises are now certified clear. You have 24 hours to vacate, Mr. Stendahl. The building is scheduled for conversion into a communal logic center. Garrett paused, looking at the black smudge on Stendahl's cheek, a single speck of ash from a burned poem. You look upset, Garrett said, his voice devoid of empathy. I'll recommend a course of chemical imbalancing. You're suffering from antiquarian melancholia. A few pills, a few weeks of light therapy. You won't even remember the names of these books. I will remember, Stendahl said, standing tall in the center of his ruined kingdom. I will remember every word, every shadow, every drop of blood that was never spilled on these pages. Garrett shrugged and signaled his men. They filed out in their silent, rubber-soled boots, leaving the cellar door open. The harsh white light from above seemed to mock the emptiness below. Stendahl and Pike stood in the silence. The only sound was the ticking of a clock that was no longer there, a ghost sound in the still air. Stendahl reached down and picked up a tiny fragment of charred paper that had escaped the fans. It was a jagged corner of a page, with only one word visible in the blackened center. Nevermore. He held it out to Pikes. They think the fire is the end, Stendahl said. He looked towards the ceiling as if he could see through the earth, through the clouds, all the way to the red spark of Mars hanging in the night sky. But fire is just a tool. We will use it better than they did. We will build a house, Pikes. A house that will never burn. A house that will wait for them. Pikes took the fragment of paper. The house of Usher? The house of Usher, Stendahl whispered. And then we will invite them to the housewarming. The city was the geometry of boredom. It was a place of flat white surfaces and right angles, where the wind seemed to apologize for blowing and rain came down in a way Scrooge never would. in pre-measured sanitary increments. There were no alleys here, for alleys held shadows, shadows held secrets. There were no crooked gables or gargoyles. There was only the endless humming efficiency of a world that had scrubbed its soul with pumice. Tom Stendahl sat on a bench of cold molded plastic in a park where the grass was a genetically modified carpet of unchanging green. He looked like a smudge of soot on a clean sheet of paper. Across from him sat Pikes. They were the outcasts, the unintegrated. To the passing citizens, people with clear eyes and empty minds who walked with the brisk, rhythmic gait of well-oiled machines, Stendahl and Pikes were ghosts. They were the relics of the unrefined age, men who still smelled of old dust and dark thoughts. "I went to the studio today," Pikes said. His voice was a dry rattle, like a dead leaf skittering across a sidewalk. "Or the studio used to be. It's a health drone hangar now. They were melting down the last of the props. I saw a technician carrying a crate of rubber bats. He thought they were insulation gaskets. He didn't know they were meant to fly." Stendahl looked at his own hands. They were light, as if the weight of his 50,000 books had been the only thing tethering him to the earth. "They've taken the toys, Pikes. And when you take the toys away from the children grow up to be cold. They grow up to be Garrett." "I had a mask," Pikes whispered, his eyes glazing over with the memory of 1,000 performances. "A mask of phantoms. It was made of silk and spiricum and a decade of my own sweat. When I wore it, I wasn't just an actor. I was every man's fear of the dark. I was the heat of the sun on a pharaoh's tomb. I was the cold gray stone of a gargoyle's perch, and the sweet chalky dust of a Mexican boneyard dance. I've been the crone by the sow and fire and the ghost of the machine. I gave them the gift of a shudder, Tom. I gave them the centuries they were too afraid to remember." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass eye, the kind used in old-fashioned horror prosthetics. It was bloodshot and yellowed. "I saved this," Pike said. "A single eye from a 3-headed dog. It's all that's left of my career." Stendahl took the glass eye and held it up to the flat white sun. "They think they've won because they've cleared the shelves and emptied the screens. They think that if they don't see the monster ceases to exist. But they're wrong, Pikes. The monster just moves. It moves from the book to the blood. It moves from the screen to the bone." Stendahl leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial hiss. "I have money. More money than a man is allowed to have in this balanced economy. My family made it in the old days, in the Steel Age, and it's sitting in offshore accounts that the Bureau hasn't found yet. It's useless paper here. I can't buy a single volume of Poe. I can't buy a single reel of your films." "And what good is it?" Pikes said. "It can buy a ticket, Pikes. It can buy a ticket," Stendahl said, his eyes burning with sudden feverish light. "Not to a city or a country or even a continent. It can buy a ticket to the Red Planet. Mars is the only place left where the moral climate hasn't reached its full freezing temperature. There's a wilderness there, Pikes. A wilderness of ancient seabeds and dead cities that already know how to hold a ghost." Pikes looked at the glass eye in Stendahl's hand. For the first time, a spark of something, not hope, but a dark creative hunger, flickered in his expression. "What would we do there, Tom? Hide?" "No," Stendahl said, his smile a jagged thing. "We won't hide. We will build. We will build a theater of the impossible. We will build a house that is a trap, a house that is a poem, a house that is a tomb. I have the blueprints in my head, Pikes. Every brick of the house of Usher, every gear of the pendulum, every mechanical bat. I have the money, but I need the craftsman. I need the man who knows how to make the dark move." The sirens of a passing health patrol wailed in the distance, the same antiseptic shriek that had signaled the end of the library. Stendahl handed the glass eye back to Pikes. "Keep the eye, Pikes. We're going to need it. We're going to build a place where the dark can finally look back at them." Pikes took the eye and closed his fist around it. The two outcasts sat together on a plastic bench, two gray men in a white world, already feeling the cold, thin wind of the Martian deserts blowing through their minds. The meeting place was a ruin that the city had forgotten to sanitize. It was an old warehouse by the docks, a cavernous ribcage of rusted iron and rotting timber that smelled of the salt-crusted past. Here the moral climate drones rarely hovered. There was nothing here to clean, only slow, honest decay of an era that had believed in heavy things. Stendahl had a sheet of gray industrial plastic over a crate to serve as a table. On it lay a single scorched scrap of paper and a collection of schematics drawn from memory. Charcoal sketches of gears, trapdoors, and the skeletal anatomy of mechanical beasts. "They think we're going to be pioneers," Stendahl said, his voice echoing the hollow warehouse. He was tapping a finger on the sketch of a pendulum. "They think we are going to Mars to build another white city, another hive of glass and logic. The Bureau of Immigration is practically giving away tickets to men of substance who could help stabilize the Martian frontier." Pikes moved around the perimeter of the light, his footsteps silent. He was looking at a drawing of Mechanical Ape, the beast from the Rue Morgue. "I've spent the last 3 nights in the subterranean archives of the old Special Effects Union," Pikes whispered. "I had to bribe a sanitation droid with a handful of copper wire. I found them, Tom. The old chemical formulas for the Hades fog, the wiring diagrams for the Karloff autons. They were marked for deletion, but the machines are slow." "And the blueprints?" Stendahl asked. "I have them here." Pikes tapped his temple. "A man who spent 40 years building monsters doesn't need paper. I know the tension required for a bat's wings. I know the frequency of a scream that will make the marrow in a man's bones turn to ice. I can build you a house, Tom, but it won't be a house. It will be a living, breathing machine of terror." Stendahl stood up and walked to the edge of the warehouse, looking out at the black water of the harbor. The city lights across the bay were a cold, surgical blue. "It must be exact, Pikes. It must be a physical manifestation of everything they burned. Every brick must be steeped in the melancholy of Poe. The tarn must be black and stagnant. The trees must be white and dead, and the atmosphere. Can you give me an atmosphere of perpetual twilight?" "On Mars? The air's thin enough to play with enough chemical dispersal and the right light filters on a valley rim. I can make the sun look like a dying ember. I can give you a world where it is always 3 a.m. Stendahl turned back to him. The intensity in his eyes was no longer that of a grieving librarian. It was the light of a general preparing a campaign. "We will move my funds in small increments," Stendahl said, laying out the compact. "Bribes to the rocket technicians, service fees to the Martian construction permit. We'll register the project as a sanitary research facility, a place to study the effects of isolation." They love those words. Sanitary, research, facility. Sounds like a hospital. They won't suspect it's a haunted house until the door locks behind them. "And when the house is finished," Pikes asked, his voice low, "when the bats are in the belfry, the pendulum is oiled, what then?" Stendahl reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. His secret list of the architects of the fire. He ran a thumb over the names. Garrett, Miller, Thompson, the men who had smiled while the books had died. "Then," Stendahl said, "we will send out the invitations. We will tell them that we have built a monument to their modern era. We will tell them it is a place of absolute logic and perfect hygiene. We will lure them across 60 million miles of space with the promise of seeing their own reflection." "And instead?" "Instead, they will find themselves inside a story." Stendahl's voice grew with a thick, dark, poetic joy. "A man I once knew, a tall, thin man who smelled of centuries and chimney sweeps, told me that the world is made of shadow and light, and the space between is where the soul breathes. These clean-minded people want a world of noonday sun, Pikes. They don't realize that without the dark to define the edges, they have no shape at all. We are going to remind them of the shadow, stories they never read, stories they thought were ash. We will be the editors of their final chapter, Spikes. We will show them that you cannot burn a ghost. You can only give it a reason to come back." Pike stepped into the light and held out a hand that had once operated the pulleys of 1,000 nightmares. "To the house of Usher, then." Tom grasped Pike's hand and shook. The compact was sealed. "To the house of Usher. May it stand just long enough to see the look on their faces." Above them, through a hole in the warehouse roof, the red eye of Mars stared down cold and expectant, waiting for the arrival of the two men who were bringing the dark back to the stars. The spaceport was a cathedral of glass and humming silence. It was a place where human soul was weighed, measured, and vacuum sealed before being shot into the void. Everywhere, the moral climate officers moved like white blood cells through a giant sterile artery, checking manifests, scanning retinas, ensuring that no stowaway dreams were hitching a ride to the colonies. Tom Stendahl stood in the center of the departure hall, his heart a frantic hammer behind ribs of ice. He wore a suit of charcoal gray, the color of a man who had nothing to hide and even less to say. Beside him stood 20 large crates, each stamped with the official blue seal of the Bureau of Sanitary Engineering. Crate 42 through 62, a customs inspector droned. He was a young man with a skin the color of a mushroom and his eyes that only saw numbers. He tapped a sonic scanner against the side of the lead crate. Consignment, atmospheric scrubbers, recirculation gaskets, destination, Mayor Sumerian Mars, consignee, Stendahl Research Group. Correct, Stendahl said. He kept his voice as flat as a tabletop. For the study of stagnant air in enclosed environments. The inspector frowned, his scanner whining as it passed over the crate. High-density readings here. What's the composition of these gaskets? Stendahl felt a drop of sweat crawl down his spine, like a cold insect. Inside that crate, hidden beneath a layer of industrial rubber, were the mechanical components of the Red Death, the clockwork anatomy of an android that would one day walk through a masquerade ball with a face like a rotting shroud. Lead-lined polymers. Pike stepped forward, his face a masterpiece of boredom. He held up a clipboard filled with fake, mind-numbingly dull statistics. To prevent radiation seepage from the Martian subsoil, if you'd like, I can walk you through the molecular breakdown. It takes about 6 hours. The inspector looked at Pikes, then at the mountain of paperwork. The moral climate had succeeded in making the world so boring that even its own enforcers were desperate to escape a lecture. Pass, the inspector muttered, slapping a green clear decal onto the crate. They moved to the next row. The crates were marked architectural samples, synthetic stone. Inside them, wrapped in acoustic foam, were the forbidden stones of the House of Usher, hollowed-out blocks containing microfilms of the banned libraries of Earth. Stendahl had spent months photographing the pages of Poe, Lovecraft, Hawthorne, shrinking the giants of literature down to the size of a fingernail. More stone? The inspector asked, his boredom turning to mild suspicion. The Martian colonists are supposed to use local materials. Shipping Earthstone is a violation of the Weight Efficiency Act of '94. Not for research, Stendahl said, his voice tightening. We need a control group of Terran minerals to measure the erosion rates of the Martian winds. It's a 5-year study approved by the Office of Structural Integrity. He handed over a forged permit, a document Pikes had spent weeks perfecting in a dark basement using a stolen government seal and a printer that should have been melted down years ago. The inspector scanned the permit. The light on his terminal blinked amber, then green. Everything seems in order. You people sure love your data. Data is the only thing that keeps us sane, Stendahl said. It was a joke the inspector couldn't possibly understand. As the crates were hoisted onto the magnetic conveyor belt toward the waiting rockets, Pikes leaned in close to Stendahl. The bats in the third cargo bay, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the venting gases, hidden inside the hollow legs of the laboratory tables. The pendulum. The blade is disguised as a curved support strut for the main telescope. Stendahl nodded, watching as his library disappeared into the belly of the ship. He felt a strange, light-headed vertigo. They were smuggling a revolution of the macabre into the noses of the men who had invented the word sterile. What about the films? Stendahl asked. Pikes tapped the thick-soled boots he was wearing. The souls are hollow. I'm walking on 3,000 feet of the mask of the Red Death and the murders in the Rue Morgue. Every step I take toward the rocket is a reel of film they think is gone forever. They reached the final checkpoint, the psychological screening. A woman with a face like a frozen lake sat behind a glass partition. Purpose of travel? Relocation, Stendahl said. I find the Earth distracting. I wish to contribute to the logical expansion of the Martian frontier. Are you carrying any items of sentimental or imaginative value? She asked, her eyes searching in his face for a flicker of a lie. Any artifacts of the unrefined age? Art, fiction, non-functional decorative objects? Stendahl looked her directly in the eye. He thought of the fire. He thought of the smell of burning leather and the way the Wizard of Oz had turned to green ash. I am carrying nothing but the future, Stendahl said. The past is a charred ruin. I have no interest in it. The woman pressed a button. The heavy steel doors to the boarding ramp hissed open. Safe journey, Citizen Stendahl. May you find the peace of balanced mind on the Red Planet. Stendahl and Pikes walked down the long, white umbilical cord toward the rocket. The walls were lined with posters showing happy, smiling workers in white jumpsuits standing in front of identical glass buildings on Mars. A new world for a new logic, the posters screamed. They stepped into the airlock. The door groaned shut, sealing out the air of the Earth. The air that smelled of bleach and censored breaths. Did you hear her, Pikes? Stendahl said, his voice finally breaking into a low, jagged laugh. She told me to find the peace of a balanced mind. Pikes reached down and unzipped his coveralls, revealing a hidden pocket. He pulled out a single small object, a mechanical spider no larger than a coin, its brass legs twitching with a life of its own. He set it on the sterile white floor of the cabin. I think we're going to have a very different kind of balance, Pike said. The rocket shuddered. A deep thrumming vibration rose through the floorboards, shaking their bones. Outside the thick quartz porthole, the ground began to fall away. The great white boring cities of Earth shrunk until they were nothing but tiny pale scabs on the skin of the world. Stendahl watched as the sky turned from blue to black. He felt the weight of the gravity press, but his heart felt lighter than it had in 30 years. We are redactants, Pikes, Stendahl said as the stars began to emerge, sharp and cold. They redacted our books, so we redacted our lives. They think they are sending 2 researchers to a laboratory. They don't realize they are sending 2 ghosts to a haunting. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the Great Fire, he allowed himself to dream. He didn't dream of white cities or logical futures. He dreamed of a house with cracked walls and vacant eye-lock windows, a house that stood on the edge of a black tarn, waiting for the visitors to arrive. The rocket screamed into the vacuum, a silver needle carrying the thread of a nightmare into the silent tapestry of space. The rocket didn't land so much as it surrendered to the gravity of a dead world. It descended on a pillar of chemical fire, scorching the cinnamon-colored dust of the Mare Cimmerium, a silver intruder in a valley that had known only the silence of 10 million years. Why it was colored like cinnamon, I don't know. But thankfully cinnamon is here. Maybe she can tell us. When the engines finally cut, the silence that rushed back in was physical. It was a cold, thin, ancient weight that pressed against the hull of the ship like the hand of a ghost. Inside the airlock, William Stendahl waited for the pressure to equalize. He stood with his eyes closed, listening to the metal of the ship contract and pop in the Martian chill. Beside him, Pikes was checking the seals on his oxygen respirator, but his movements were different now. On Earth, he had moved with the twitchy, nervous energy of a man under a microscope. Here, beneath the gaze of the same yet different sun, he seemed to grow taller, his shadow lengthening against the bulkhead. Can you feel it, Pikes? Stendahl whispered. The air? The freedom, Stendahl said. The delicious, terrifying lack of a moral climate. There are no sirens here, no investigators, no one to tell us the dark is a disease. The outer hatch groaned and hissed, a swinging open to reveal a landscape that looked like a dream of dying fire. The sky was a pale, bruised lavender, and the sun was a small gold coin tossed into a vast, deep well. Stretching out before them was the valley, a desolation of wind-sculpted stone and sand that flowed like slow red water. Stendahl stepped out onto the boarding ramp. His boots made a soft, crunching sound in the dust, the sound of a man walking on the bones of a civilization. He looked out across the valley floor to where a natural depression in the rock had gathered a pool of stagnant metallic water. There, Stendahl pointed a trembling finger. The tarn. It was a black, motionless mirror, reflecting nothing but the thin, cold stars that were already beginning to prick through the violet sky. It was exactly as Poe had described it, dank, silent, and sepulchral. It's perfect, Pike said, stepping down beside him. He knelt and ran a hand through the red dust. The soil is rich in iron. I can use the oxidation to create the rust streaks on the walls. I can brew a chemical fog that will cling to that water and never lift it. We won't just build a house, Tom. We'll grow it out of the ground like a fungus. They spent the next several hours unloading the crates, the atmospheric scrubber, the synthetic stone that held the DNA of their revenge. As they worked, the Martian wind began to rise, a high, thin whistling that sounded like a flute played by a madman. It blew through the ribs of the cargo struts and the hollow legs of the laboratory tables, creating a dissonant music that made Stendahl shiver with delight. "Listen," Stendahl said, pausing with a crate in his arms. "The wind is already rehearsing our play." By midnight, a Martian midnight of profound absolute blackness, they had established their base camp. A small pressurized bubble sat on the rim of a valley, looking like a discarded pearl. Inside, with the light of a single flickering battery lamp, Stendahl sat on a folding chair and reached into his inner pocket. He pulled out the small charged scrap of paper he had salvaged from his ruins of his library on Earth. Nevermore. He laid it on a portable table. Beside it, he unrolled a fresh sheet of architectural vellum. With a pen filled with ink as black as the tarn outside, he began to draw. He didn't draw a research facility. He drew a laboratory. He drew a fissure, a long zigzagging crack that started at the roof of the great stone house and ran all the way down to the foundation, where it disappeared into the dark water. "Mr. Bigelow will arrive in 3 days, Stendahl said, his voice reflecting the madness of the landscape. "The architect. He's a man of logic, Pikes, a man of the new era. He will build what I tell him to build because he has no imagination to tell him otherwise. He will see stones and mortar. He won't see the trap until the ceiling is over his head." Pikes was in the corner, working on the mechanical spider he had smuggled. He was adjusting the tension in its legs, making it scuttle with a terrifying rhythmic procession. "And the others? The robots? The beasts?" "We will build them in the cellars," Stendahl said. "While Bigelow works on the shell, we will weave the silk. We will build the apes in the pits and the pendulums in the dark where the moral climate can't see them. We will create a sanctuary for every banned thought, every burned poem, and every discarded nightmare." Stendahl stood up and walked to the window of the bubble. Outside, the Martian moon, Phobos, was rising, a jagged, irregular stone hurtling across the sky. Its weak light cast long, dancing shadows across the valley. In his mind's eye, the house was already there. He could see it. The gray walls, the vacant eye-like windows, the rank sedges. He could hear the mechanical bats flapping in the rafters and the slow, rhythmic tick-tock, tick-tock of the pendulum waiting to descend. He felt a sense of completion that was almost religious. Earth had tried to sanitize him, to wash his mind clean of the filth of fantasy, but the red sands of Mars had proved to be a better ink. 30 years, Stendahl whispered, his breath fogging the glass. 30 years of waiting for the fire to go out. Well, the fire is out, and now the evening begins. He turned back to the table, picking up the pen, and wrote the first instructions for the architect who would arrive within the week. He wrote it in a firm, elegant hand. The hand of a man who was no longer a victim, but a master of ceremonies. The prequel was over. The planning was done. The smuggling was a success. The stage was set. The Tarn was waiting, and the red dust of Mars was ready to drink the blood of the men who thought they could kill a story. Stendahl smiled, and in the reflection of the window, his teeth looked like white grave markers. "Pikes, get the masks ready. We have a lot of work to do before the guests arrive." And so as the sun rises on the first day of construction, our next scene is the beginning of Ray Bradbury's Usher II. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within the view of the melancholy house of Usher. Mr. William Thomas Stendahl paused in his quotation. There upon a low black hill stood the house, its cornerstone bearing the inscription 2005 A.D. Mr. Bigelow, the architect, said, "It's completed. Here's a key, Mr. Stendahl." The two men stood together silently in the quiet autumn afternoon. Blueprints rustled, made a bunch of noise on the raven grass at their feet. "The house of Usher," said Mr. Stendahl with pleasure. Planned, built, paid for. Hey, I didn't turn on the voice, did I? I just this second realized that. Sorry, guys. Now you can listen in voice or stream or media if you want. Sorry about that. Where were we? Yes. The house of Usher, Mr. Stendahl said with pleasure. Planned, built, bought, paid for. Wouldn't Mr. Poe be delighted? Mr. Bigelow squinted. Is it everything you wanted, sir? Yes. Is the color right? Is it desolate and terrible? Very desolate. Very terrible. And the walls were bleak? Amazingly so. The tarn, is it black and lurid enough? Most incredibly black and lurid. And the sedge, we've dyed it, you know. Is it the proper gray and ebon? It's hideous. Mr. Bigelow consulted his architectural plans. From these he quoted in part, does the whole structure cause an iciness, a sickening of the heart, a dreariness of the thought? Does it scare the bejeebers out of you? The house, the lake, the land, Mr. Stendahl? Mr. Bigelow, it's worth every penny. My God, it's beautiful. Well, thank you. I had to work in total ignorance. Thank the Lord you own private rockets. We'd never been allowed to bring most of that equipment through. You notice it's always twilight here, this land. Always October. Bare and sterile dead. It took a bit of doing. We killed everything. 10,000 tons of DDT. Not a snake, a frog, or a Martian fly left. Always twilight here, Mr. Stendahl, always twilight. I'm proud of that. There are machines hidden which blot out the sun. It's always properly dreary. Stendahl drank it in, the dreariness, the oppression, the fetid vapors, the whole atmosphere so delicately contrived and fitted. And that house, that crumbling horror, that evil lake, the fungi, the extensive decay, plastic or otherwise, who could guess? He looked up at the autumn sky. Somewhere above, beyond, far off, was the sun. Somewhere it was the month of April on the planet of Mars, a yellow month with a blue sky. Somewhere above, the rockets burned down to civilize a beautifully dead planet. The sound of their screaming passage was muffled by this dim, soundproofed world, this ancient autumn world. Well, now that my job's done, said Mr. Bigelow uneasily, I'll feel free to ask you what you're going to do with all this. With Usher? Haven't you guessed? Does the name Usher mean nothing to you? Oh, nothing. What about this name, Edgar Allan Poe? Mr. Bigelow shook his head. Well, of course. A combination of dismay and contempt. How could I expect you to know blessed Mr. Poe? He died a long while ago, before Lincoln. All his books were burned in the Great Fire. That's 30 years ago, 1975. Said Mr. Bigelow wisely. One of those. Yes, one of those, Bigelow. He and Lovecraft and Hawthorne and Ambrose Bierce and all the tales of terror and fantasy and horror, and for that matter, tales of the future, were burned heartlessly. They passed a law. Oh, it started very small. In 1950 and 60, it was a grain of sand. They began by controlling books of cartoons, and then detective books, and of course films one way or the other, one group or another, political bias, religious prejudice, union pressures, and there was always a minority afraid of something, Bigelow, and a great majority afraid of the dark, afraid of the future, afraid of the past, afraid of the present, afraid of themselves and shadows of themselves. I see. Afraid of the word politics, which eventually became a synonym for communism among the more reactionary elements, so I hear, and it was worth your life to use that word. With a screw tightened here, a bolt fastened there, a push, a pull, a yank, art and literature were soon like a great twine of taffy strung about, being twisted in braids and tied in knots and thrown in all directions, until there was no more resiliency and no more savor to it. Then the film cameras chopped short, and the theaters turned dark, and the print presses trickled down from a great Niagara of reading material to a mere innocuous dripping of pure matter. Oh, the word escape was radical, too, I tell you. Was it? It was. Every man, they said, must face reality, must face the here and now. Everything that was not, must go. All the beautiful literary lies and flights of fancy that must be shot in midair. So they lined up against the wall. against the library wall one Sunday morning 30 years ago in 1975. They lined them up, St. Nicholas and the Headless Horseman and Snow White and Rumpelstiltskin and Mother Goose. Oh, what a wailing! And they shot them down and burned the paper castles and the fairy frogs and the old kings and the people who lived happily ever after. For of course it was a fact that nobody lived happily ever after, and once upon a time became no more. And they spread the ashes of the phantom rickshaw with the rubble of the land of Oz. They filleted the bones of Glinda the Good and Ozma and shattered polychrome at a spectroscope and served Jack Pumpkinhead meringue at the biologist's ball. The beanstalk died in a bramble of red tape. Sleeping Beauty awoke with the kiss of a scientist, expired at the fatal puncture of his syringe, and they made Alice drink something from a bottle which reduced her to a size she could no longer cry curiouser and curiouser, and they gave the looking glass one hammer blow to smash it and every red king and oyster away. He clenched his fists. Lord, how immediate it was. His face was red. He was gasping for breath. As for Mr. Bigelow, he was astounded at this long explosion. He blinked and at last said, Sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Just names to me. From what I hear, the burning was a good thing. Get out! Screamed Stendahl. You've done your job. Now let me alone, you idiot! Mr. Bigelow summoned his carpenters and went away. Mr. Stendahl stood alone before his house. Listen here, he said to the unseen rockets. I came to Mars to get away from you clean-minded people, so you're flocking in thicker every day, like flies to offal. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to teach you a fine lesson for what you did to Mr. Poe on Earth. As of this day, beware. The House of Usher is open for business. He pushed a fist to the sky. The rocket landed. A man stepped out jauntily. He glanced at the house. His gray eyes were displeased and vexed. He strode across the moat to confront the small man there. Your name Stendahl? Yes. I'm Garrett, investigator of moral climates. Perhaps you remember me. Yes, Garrett. So you finally got to Mars, you and your moral climate people. We arrived last week. We'll soon have things as neat and tidy as Earth. The man waved an identification card irritably toward the house. Suppose you tell me about that place, Mr. Stendahl? It's a haunted castle, if you like. I don't like, Stendahl. I don't like. The sound of that word, haunted? Simple enough. In this year of our Lord 2005, I have built a mechanical sanctuary. In it, copper bats fly in electronic beams, brass rats scuttle in the plastic cellars, robot skeletons dance, robot vampires, harlequins, wolves, white phantoms, compounded of chemical ingenuity, live here. That's what I was afraid of, said Garrett, smiling quietly. I'm afraid we're going to have to tear your place down. I knew you'd come out as soon as you received our special invitation. Oh, I'd have come sooner, but we at Moral Climates wanted to be sure of your intentions before we moved in. We can have the dismantlers and burning crew here by supper. By midnight, your place will be razed to the cellar. Mr. Stendahl, I consider you somewhat of a fool, sir, spending hard-earned money on a folly. Why, it must have cost you millions of dollars, nearly $1 billion. But, Mr. Garrett, I inherited several fortunes when very young. I can afford to throw it about. Seems a dreadful shame, though, to have the house finished only 1 hour and you race out with your dismantlers. Couldn't you possibly let me play with my toy for just, 24 hours? Oh, you know the law. Strict to the letter. No books, no houses, nothing to be produced which in any way suggests ghosts, vampires, fairies, or any creature of the imagination. You'll be burning Babbitt next. You caused me all of this, all of us a lot of trouble, Mr. Stendahl. 20 years ago, on Earth, you and your library. Yes, me and my library. And a few others like me. Oh, Poe's been forgotten for many years now, and Oz and the other creatures. But I had my little cash. We had our libraries, a few private citizens, until you and your men came round with torches and incinerators and tore my 50,000 books up and burned them, just as you put a stake through the heart of Halloween and told your film producers that if they made anything at all, they'd have to make and remake Ernest Hemingway. My God, how many times have I seen For Whom the Bell Tolls done? 30 different versions, all realistic. Ha ha! Oh, realism. Oh, here. Oh, how now. Oh, hell. You and your moral climates. You didn't just burn books, Garrett. You tried to bury every dreamer with a stake of holly through his heart. You looked at the great harvest and saw nothing but a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, or a fragment of an underdone potato. You thought you could dismiss the ghosts of our culture as mere indigestion. Well, look around you, investigator. The potato has grown quite large, hasn't it? Oh, it doesn't pay to be bitter. Mr. Garrett, you must turn in a full report, mustn't you? Yes. Then for curiosity's sake, you'd better come in and look around. It'll only take a minute. All right, lead the way. And no tricks. I've a gun with me. The door to the house of Usher creaked wide. A moist wind issued forth. There was an immense sighing and moaning, like a subterranean bellows breathing in the lost catacombs. A rat pranced through the floor stones. Garrett, crying out, gave it a kick. It fell over, the rat did, and from its nylon fur streamed an incredible horde of metal fleas. Amazing, Garrett bent to see. An old witch sat in a niche, quivering her wax hands over some orange and blue tarot cards. She jerked her head and hissed through her toothless mouth at Garrett, tapping her greasy cards. Death, 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 she cried. Now that's the sort of thing I mean, said Garrett. Deplorable. I'll let you burn her personally. Will you really? Garrett was pleased, then he frowned. I must say you're taking this all so very well. It was enough just to be able to create this place, to be able to say I did it, to say I nurtured a medieval atmosphere in a modern incredulous world. I have a somewhat reluctant admiration for your genius myself, sir. Garrett watched a mist drift by, whispering, shaped like a beautiful nebulous woman, down another dank corridor of machine world. Like the stuff from a cotton candy centrifuge, mist sprang up and floated, murmuring in the silent holes. An ape appeared out of nowhere. Hold on, cried Garrett. An ape? An orangutan, actually. Don't be afraid. Stendahl tapped the animal's heavy chest. A robot. Copper skeleton and all, like the witch, see? He stroked the fur, and under metal tubing came to light. Oh, yes. Garrett put out a timid hand to pet the thing. But why, Mr. Stendahl? Why all this? What obsessed you? Bureaucracy, Mr. Garrett, but I haven't time to explain. The government will discover soon enough. He nodded to the orangutan. All right. Now. The ape killed, Mr. Garrett. Are we all ready? Are we almost ready, Pikes? Pikes looked up from the table. Yes, sir. You've done a splendid job. Well, you paid for it all, Tom. In more ways than one, said Pikes softly as he lifted the plastic eyelid of the robot and inserted the glass eyeball to fasten the rubberoid muscles neatly. There. The spitting image of Mr. Garrett. So what do we do with him, sir? Pikes nodded at the slab where the real Mr. Garrett lay dead. Better burn him, Pikes. We wouldn't want two Mr. Garretts around, would we? Pikes wheeled Mr. Garrett to the brick incinerator. Goodbye. He pushed Mr. Garrett in and slammed the door. Stendahl confronted the robot Garrett. You have your orders, Garrett? Yes, sir. The robot sat up. I'm to return to moral climates. I'll file a complimentary report. Delay action for at least 48 hours. Say I'm investigating more fully. Right, Garrett. Goodbye. The robot hurried out to Garrett's rocket, got in, and flew away. Stendahl turned. Now, Pikes, we send the remainder of the invitations for tonight. I think we'll have a jolly time, don't you? Considering we waited 20 years? Quite jolly. They winked at each other. 7 o'clock. Well, 8 o'clock in our world, which means we have about 15 or 20 minutes left. But on we go. Maybe not that long. Anyway, 7 o'clock. Stendahl studied his watch. Almost time. He twirled a sherry glass in his hand. He sat quietly. Above him, among the oaken beams, the bats, the delicate copper bodies hidden under rubber flesh, blinked at him and shrieked. He raised his glass to them. To our success. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and considered the entire affair. How he would savor this in his old age, this paying back of the antiseptic government for literary terrors and conflagrations. Oh, how the anger and hatred had grown in him through the years. Oh, how the plan had taken slow shape in his numbed mind, until that day when he had found Pikes again. Now, even knowing his life would be cut short by one precious year, it was worth it, for he could never have done all this without Pikes. Oh, yes, Pikes. Pikes with the bitterness in him as deep as black, charred well of green acid. Who was Pikes? Only the greatest of them all. Pikes, the man of 10,000 faces, a fury, a smoke, a blue fog, a white rain, a bat, a gargoyle, a monster. That was Pikes. Better than Lon Chaney, the father? Stendahl ruminated. Night after night he had watched Chaney in the old films. Yes, better than Chaney. Better than that other ancient mummer. What was his name? Karloff? Far better. Lugosi? The comparison was odious. No, there was only one Pikes. In his long ago youth, he had grown up in a small town by a small river and a small lake in a small northern port of a Midwest state, a town full of trees and dry grass and dead flowers in the glorious autumn, full of fences to walk on and sidewalks to skate on, and a large ravine to tumble in and yell across. And the town was full of boys. And Pikes was the boy all other boys adored. He was the greatest boy who ever lived, the grandest boy who ever fell out of a tree, the jolliest boy who ever hunted out all the haunted houses in town and came back to report on them, and take all the kids to ramble through the basements and scramble up the ivy outside bricks and shout down the chimneys, hooting and chimpanzee dancing and ape bellowing. On the day he was born, all the soda pop bottles in the world fizzed over. He could yell louder, run faster, sing better, and eat more popcorn. Yes, Pikes had been the greatest boy who ever lived. And now, he was a man stripped of his fantasies. No place on earth to go, no one to show off to. His beloved Halloween, forbidden worldwide. Poor impossible, defeated Joseph Pip Pikes. How must it have felt, Pikes, the night they seized your films, like entrails yanked from a camera, out of your guts, clutching them in coils and wads to stuff them up a stove to burn away? Did it feel as bad as having some 50,000 books annihilated with no recompense? Yes. Stendahl felt his hands grow cold with a senseless anger. So what more natural than one day they would talk over endless coffee pots into innumerable midnights, and out of all the talk and the bitter brewings would come the house of Usher. A great church bell rang. The guests were arriving. Smiling, he went to greet them. Full grown without memory, the robots waited. In green silks, the color of forest pools, in silks the color of frog and fen, they waited. In yellow hair, the color of sun and sand, the robots waited. Oiled with tube bones cut from bronze and sunk in gelatin, the robots lay. In coffins for the not dead and not alive, in planked boxes, the metronomes waited to be set in motion. There was a smell of lubrication and lathe brass. There was a silence of the tomb yard, sexed but sexless, the robots. Named but unnamed, and borrowing from humans everything but humanity. The robots stared at the nailed lids of their labeled FOB boxes and a death that was not even a death, for there had never been a life. And now there was a vast screaming of yanked nails. Now there was a lifting of lids. Now there were shadows in the boxes and the pressure of a hand squirting oil from a can. Now one clock was set in motion, a faint ticking. Now another and another, until this was an immense clock shop purring. The marble eyes rolled wide of their rubber lids. The nostrils winked. The robots, clothed in hair of ape and white of rabbit, arose. Tweedledum following Tweedledee, mock turtle, dormouse, drowned bodies from the sea, compounded of salt and white weed, swaying. Hanging blue-throated men with turned-up clam-flesh eyes and the creatures of ice and burning tinsel, loam dwarves and pepper elves, Tick-Tock, Regito, St. Nicholas with a self-made snow flurrying, blowing on before him, Bluebeard with whiskers like acetylene flame and sulfur clouds from which green fire snouts protruded, in a scaly, gigantic serpentine, a dragon with a furnace in its belly, reeled out the door with a scream, a tick, a bellow, a silence, a rush, a wind. 10,000 lids fell back. The clock shop moved out into Usher. The night was enchanted. A warm breeze came over the land. The guest rockets burning the sky and turning the weather from autumn to spring arrived. The men stepped out in evening clothes, and women stepped out after them, their hair coiffed in elaborate detail. So that's Usher. But where's the door? At this moment, Stendahl appeared. The women laughed and chattered. Mr. Stendahl raised a hand to quiet them. Turning, he looked up to a high castle window and called out, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair. And from above, a beautiful maiden leaned out upon the night wind and let down her golden hair. and the hair twined and blew and became a ladder upon which the guests might ascend, laughing, into the house. Oh, what eminent sociologists, what clever psychologists, what tremendously important politicians, bacteriologists, and neurologists. There they stood within the clammy walls. Welcome, all of you. Mr. Tryon, Mr. Owen, Mr. Dunn, Mr. Lang, Mr. Steffens, Mr. Fletcher, and a double dozen more. Come in, come in. Miss Gibbs, Miss Pope, Miss Churchill, Miss Blunt, Miss Drummond, and a score of other women, glittering. Eminent people, one and all, members of the Society for the Prevention of Fantasy, advocators of the banishment of Halloween and Guy Fawkes, killers of bats, burners of books, bearers of torches, good, clean citizens, every one, who had waited until the rough men had come up and buried the Martians and cleansed the cities and built the towns and repaired the highways and made everything safe. And then, with everything well on its way to safety, the spoil funds, the people with mercurochrome for blood and iodine-colored eyes, came now to set up their moral climates and dole out goodness to everyone, and they were his friends. Yes, carefully, Stendahl had met and befriended each of them on Earth in the last year. Welcome to the vast halls of death, he cried. Hello, Stendahl, what is all this? Oh, you'll see. Everyone off with their clothes. You'll find booths to one side there, changing the costumes you find. Men on this side, women on that. The people stood uneasily about. Well, I don't know if we should stay, said Miss Pope. I don't like the looks of this. It verges on blasphemy. Nonsense, a costume ball. Seems quite illegal, Mr. Steffens sniffed about. Oh, come off it, Stendahl laughed. Enjoy yourselves. Tomorrow it'll be in a ruin. Get in the booths. The house blazed with life and color. Harlequins rang with belled caps, and white mice danced miniature quadrilles to the music of dwarfs who tickled tiny fiddles with tiny bows. Flags rippled from scorched beams, while bats flew in clouds about the gargoyles' mouths with spouted down wine, cool, wild, and foaming. A creek wandered through the 7 rooms of the masked ball. Guests sipped and found it to be sherry. Guests poured from the booths, transformed from one age into another, their faces covered with dominoes. The very act of putting on a mask revoking all their licenses to pick a quarrel with fantasy and horror. The women swept about in red gowns, laughing. The men danced them in attendance. And on the walls were shadows with no people to throw them. Or here or there were mirrors in which no image showed. All of us vampires, laughed Mr. Fletcher. Dead! There were 7 rooms, each with a different color. One blue, one purple, one green, one orange, another white, the 6th violet, and the 7th shrouded in black velvet. And in the black room was an ebony clock which struck the hour loud. And through these rooms the guests ran, drunk at last among the robot fantasies, amid the dormice and mad hatters, the trolls and the giants, the black cats and the white queens. And under their dancing feet the floor gave off a massive pumping beat of a hidden telltale heart. Mr. Stendahl. A whisper. Mr. Stendahl. A monster with the face of death stood at his elbow. It was Pikes. I must see you, alone. What is it? Here. Pikes held out a skeleton hand. In it were a few half-melted charred wheels. Nuts, cogs, bolts. Stendahl looked at them for a long moment. Then he drew back Pikes into a corner. Is that Garrett? He whispered. Pikes nodded. He sent a robot in his place. Cleaning out the incinerator a moment ago, I found these. They both stared at the fateful cogs for a time. This means the police will be here any minute, said Pikes. Our plan will be ruined. Stendahl glanced into the whirling yellow and blue and orange people. The music swept through the misting halls. I should have guessed Garrett wouldn't be fool enough to come in person. But wait. What's the matter? Nothing. There's nothing the matter. Garrett sent a robot to us. Well, we'll send one back. Unless he checks closely, he won't notice the switch. Of course. Next time he'll come himself. Now that he thinks it's safe, why, he might be at the door any minute in person. More wine, Pikes. The great bell rang. There he is now, I'll bet you. Go let Mr. Garrett in. Rapunzel let down her golden hair. Mr. Stendahl? Mr. Garrett? The real Mr. Garrett? The same. Garrett eyed the steamy walls and the whirling people. I thought I'd better come see for myself. You can't depend on robots, other people's robots especially. I also took the precaution of summoning the dismantlers. They'll be here in 1 hour to knock the props out from under this horrible place. Stendahl bowed. Thanks for telling me. He waved his hand. In the meantime, you might as well enjoy this. A little wine? No, thank you. What's going on? How low can a man sink? See for yourself, Mr. Garrett. Murder, said Garrett. Murder most foul, said Stendahl. A woman screamed. Miss Pope ran up, her face the color of a cheese. The most horrid thing just happened. I saw Miss Blunt strangled by an ape and stuffed up a chimney. They looked, and they saw long yellow hair trailing down from the flue. Garrett cried out. Horrid, sobbed Miss Pope, then ceased crying. She blinked and turned. Miss Blunt! Yes, said Miss Blunt, standing there. But I just saw you crammed up the flue. No, it was a robot of myself, a clever facsimile. But, oh, don't cry, darling, I'm quite all right. Let me look at myself. Oh, well, so here I am up the chimney, like you said. Isn't that funny? Miss Blunt walked away, laughing. Have a drink, Garrett? I believe I will. That unnerved me. My God, what a place. This does deserve tearing down. For a moment there. Garrett drank. Another scream. Mr. Steffens, borne upon the shoulders of 4 white rabbits, was carried down a flight of stairs which magically appeared on the floor. Into a pit went Mr. Steffens, where, bound and tied, he was left to face the advancing razor steel of a great pendulum which now whirled down closer and closer and closer to his outraged body. Huh, is that me down there? Said Mr. Steffens, appearing at Garrett's elbow. He bent over the pit. Oh, how strange, how odd to see yourself die. The pendulum made a final stroke. Oh, how realistic, said Mr. Steffens, turning away. Another drink, Mr. Garrett? Yes, please. It won't be long. The dismantlers will be here. Oh, thank God. And for a third time, a scream. And what now? Said Garrett apprehensively. It's my turn, said Miss Drummond. Look! And a second Miss Drummond, shrieking, was nailed into a coffin and thrust into the raw earth under the floor. Why, I remember that, gasped the investigator of moral climates. From the old forbidden books, the premature burial. And the others, the pit, the pendulum, the ape, the chimney, the murders in the Rue Morgue, and a book I burned, yes. Another drink, Garrett. Here, hold your glass steady. My Lord, you have an imagination, haven't you? They stood and watched 5 others die, one in the mouth of a dragon, the others thrown off into the black tarn, sinking and vanishing. Would you like to see what we have planned for you? Asked Stendahl. Certainly, said Garrett. What's the difference? We'll blow the whole damn thing up anyway. You're nasty. Come along, then, this way. He led Garrett down into the floor, through numerous passages, and down again upon the spiral stairs into the earth, into the catacombs. What do you want to show me down here? Said Garrett. Yourself killed. A duplicate? Yes, and also something else. What? The Amontillado, said Stendahl, going ahead with a blazing lantern which he held high. Skeletons froze half out of coffin lids. Garrett held his hand to his nose, his face disgusted. What? Haven't you ever heard of the Amontillado? No. Don't you recognize this? Stendahl pointed to a cell. Should I? Or this? Stendahl produced a trowel from under his cape, smiling. What's that thing? Come, said Stendahl. They stepped into a cell in the dark. Stendahl fixed the chains to the half-drunken men. For God's sake, what are you doing? Shouted Garrett, rattling about. I'm being ironic. Don't interrupt a man in the midst of being ironic. It's not polite. There. You've locked me in chains. So I have. What are you going to do? Leave you here. You're joking. A very good joke. Where's my duplicate? Don't we see him killed? There's no duplicate. But the others? The others are dead. The ones you saw killed were the real people, Garrett. The duplicates, the robots stood by and watched. Garrett said nothing. Now you're supposed to say, for the love of God, Montresor, said Stendahl. And I will reply, yes, for the love of God. Won't you say it? Come on, say it. You fool! Must I coax you? Say it. Say, for the love of God, Montresor. I won't, you idiot. Get me out of here. He was sober now. Here, put this on. Stendahl tossed in something that belled and rang. A cap and bells. Put it on, I might let you out. Stendahl. Put it on, I said. Garrett obeyed. The bells tinkled. Don't you have a feeling that this has all happened before? Inquired Stendahl, setting to work with a trowel and mortar and brick now. What are you doing? Walling you in. Here's one row. Here's another. You're insane. I won't argue that point. You'll be prosecuted for this. He tapped a brick and placed it into the wet mortar, humming. Now there was a thrashing and a pounding and a crying out from within the darkening place. The bricks rose higher. More thrashing, please, said Stendahl. Let's make it a good show. Let me out! Let me out of here! There was one last brick to shove in place. The screaming was continuous. Garrett! Garrett! Garrett silenced himself. Garrett, said Stendahl. Do you know why I've done this to you? Because you burned Mr. Poe's books without really reading them. You took other people's advice that they needed burning. Otherwise, you'd have realized what I was going to do to you when we came down here a moment ago. Ignorance is fatal, Mr. Garrett. Garrett was silent. I want this to be perfect, said Stendahl, holding his lantern up so light penetrated in upon the slumped figure. Jingle your bells, softly. The bells rustled. Now, if you'll please say, for the love of God, Montresor, I might let you free. The man's face came up in the light. There was a hesitation. Then grotesquely the man said, For the love of God, Montresor. Said Stendahl, eyes closed. He shoved the last brick into place and mortared it in tight. Requiescat in pace, dear friend. Then he hastened from the catacomb. In the 7 rooms, the sound of a midnight clock brought everything to a halt. The Red Death appeared. Stendahl turned for a moment into the door to watch, and then he ran out of the great house, across the moat to where the helicopter waited. Ready, Pikes? Ready. There it goes. They looked at the great house, smiling. It began to crack down the middle, as with an earthquake, and as Stendahl watched the magnificent sight, he heard Pikes reading from behind him in a low, cadenced voice. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a low, tumultuous shouting sound like a voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep, dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. The helicopter rose over the steaming lake and flew into the west. And so ends our journey through Bradbury's original masterpiece, preceded by our own look into the shadows that led them there. Now, dear friends, if you have the nerve to see what grows from these red sands, join us at 9 p.m. for the sequel and the epilogue, Beyond the House of Usher. We shall move from the dismal doom of the past toward a strange dystopian hope. If you must depart, look for us on YouTube in the coming days, and for those who stay, the fire is just beginning. The helicopter rose like a frantic insect, its blades beating the thin Martian air into a rhythmic thrum that vibrated into the very marrow of Stendahl's teeth. Below them, the world was ending in a series of slow, wet gulps. The house of Usher did not simply fall. It succumbed. The great fissure, the one Stendahl had dreamt of in a warehouse on Earth, had finally zipped open, and the black ancient waters of the tarn were busy swallowing the gray stones, the mechanical bats, and the shattered remains of the world's most dangerous bureaucrats. Stendahl leaned his forehead against the cold plexiglass. His breath fogged the view, a white ghost appearing and disappearing over the wreckage. Look at it, Pikes, Stendahl whispered. His voice was hoarse, the voice of a man who had spent the last hour screaming inside a dream. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. There's a period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. Pikes didn't look back. His hands were locked on the flight controls, his thin face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the instrument panel. The sentence isn't over, Tom. We just finished the first chapter. Look at the horizon. South, southeast. Stendahl shifted his gaze. Far across the cinnamon dunes, toward the white geometric lights of the new Syracuse colony, a spark of movement caught his eye. It was a cluster of blue-white stars, moving with a clinical, purposeful speed. "Drones," Pikes said. "The dismantlers and burning crew. They must have had a satellite lock on the valley. When the house's structural integrity failed, it probably triggered an automatic alarm at the Bureau of Logic." "They're too late," Stendahl said, a jagged laugh catching in his throat. "There's nothing left for them to burn. Only water and silk. They can't arrest a puddle, Pikes." "No," Pikes replied, banked the helicopter sharply away from the rising steam. "But they can arrest the men who made the puddle. We're not just antiquarians anymore, Tom. We're terrorists. Terrorists of the imagination. We've committed the ultimate crime. We made them feel afraid of things that don't exist." The helicopter banked over a ridge of jagged obsidian rock, leaving the sinking house behind. The Martian landscape below was a sea of ink and frozen fire. As they flew, the silence of the cabin became heavy. The adrenaline that had fueled the murders, the breaking up of the walls, the razor-edged pendulum, was draining away, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its place. Stendahl looked down at his hands. They were stained with the dust of the house, a fine sepulchral gray powder. He thought of Garrett. He thought of the look on the man's face when the final brick had slid into place, that moment of realization where logic had failed him and the only ancient primal terror remained. "I feel light," Stendahl murmured. "That's a lack of oxygen," Pike said grimly. "Or the realization that we have nowhere to land." "No," Stendahl shook his head. "It's the books. For 30 years, I've been carrying 51,402 dead authors on my back. I've been their ghost keeper. Garrett was their sole executor, but I have been their sole residuary legatee, their sole friend, their sole mourner. Tonight I gave them their revenge. I am light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. I feel as if I could float right through this glass and into the stars." "Well, stay in your seat," Pikes commanded. "We're heading for the Blue Mountains. There are ancient Martian tunnels there, lava tubes, and the colonists haven't mapped yet. If we can get below the surface before the radar sweep hits, we might last a week." "A week," Stendahl repeated. He looked out at the two Martian moons, Phobos and Deimos, chasing each other across the velvet dark. "A week is a lifetime in a story. Poe lived 100 lifetimes in 40 years. We have the films, don't we? We have the microbooks." Pikes gestured with his chin toward a small reinforced case bolted to the floor between them. "The seeds are safe, but a seed needs soil, Tom. And right now the only soil on this planet is being paved over with white concrete and moral climate sensors." Stendahl reached out and touched the case. It was cold, but in his mind it hummed with the energy of 1,000 voices. The rustle of Alice's dress, the roar of the Jabberwocky, the silver laugh of Ozma, the echoing ghostly chains of Marley. "Oh, the soil will be ready," Stendahl said, his eyes reflecting the distant blue spark of Earth hanging in the sky. A world that thought it had won. "They think they've sterilized Mars, but they've only made it a desert. And what is a desert, Pikes, but a place waiting for the first drop of rain?" Below them, the lights of the pursuit drones fanned out across the valley they had just left, searching for the ghost of a house that no longer existed. The helicopter dipped low, skimming the shadow of a gargantuan dried-up canal and disappearing into the dark folds of the mountains. Stendahl watched the blue lights fade in the distance. He felt the weight of the little mechanical spider in his pocket, its leg twitching against its thigh. "Let them search," Stendahl whispered to the glass. "The house is gone, but the haunting has just begun." The lava tube was a cathedral of frozen shadows. It had been carved by fire millions of years ago, a long winding throat of basalt that swallowed the sound of the helicopter's dying rotors. Stendahl and Pike sat in the sudden ringing silence of the cavern, the air smelling of ancient dust and the sharp ozone tang of cooling metal. "We've but 6 hours of power in the emergency cell," Pike said, his voice echoing off the ribbed stone walls. "After that, the dark comes back for good." Stendahl didn't answer. He was looking at the cargo bay. During the frantic escape, a single heavy crate had shifted, its lid partially wrenched open by the force of their landing. From the darkness of the crate, a hand protruded. It was a pale, perfect hand, the fingers slightly curled, the skin looking disturbingly human under the flicker of the helicopter's emergency lights. "You brought him," Stendahl whispered. Pikes climbed out of the pilot seat, his movements stiff. He walked to the crate and heaved the lid back. The screech of wood on metal sounded like a scream in the enclosed space. Inside lay Garrett, or rather the thing that had been Garrett for the final act of the play. It was the robot duplicate. It had watched as the real Garrett had been bricked into the cellar wall. It was a masterpiece of Pike's craft, the same thinning hair, the same spectacles, the same expression of clinical, humorous authority. But a heavy support strut had pierced its chest during the flight, exposing a glittering nest of copper nerves and silver clockwork. "I couldn't let him sink," Mike said, his voice flat. "It was my finest work. $100,000 of synthetic nerve endings. He's the only record we have left of the enemy's face." Stendahl walked to the crate. He looked down at the machine. He looks contemplative, as if he's trying to solve a problem he doesn't have the data for. Suddenly, the robot's eyes clicked open. They weren't the eyes of a man. They were two glass lenses adjusted with a tiny whirring sound. The Garrett thing struggled to sit up, its internal gyroscopes whining as they fought against the damage in its chest. Section 4B, the robot croaked. Its voice was a distorted mimicry of the investigators, part human, part radio static. "Unauthorized, imaginative content. The moral climate is dropping." "It's malfunctioning," Pike said, reaching for the technician's kit. "The logic gate is fractured. It's pulling from the primary database and the forbidden library simultaneously." The robot's head jerked to the side. The Raven," it stuttered. A spark leapt from its neck. "The Raven says the policy is nevermore. A leaf, a wing, a pumpkin. 1 year of life for the soul of a boy. The great harvest is off schedule. Please submit your heartbeat for inspection." Stendahl felt a cold shiver trace the line of his spine. He reached out and touched the robot's forehead. It was warm. Pikes had even included a thermal heating element to simulate a living body. "Do you know me?" Stendahl asked. The robot's eyes zoomed in and out. "Stendahl. William Thomas. Classification, romantic, extremist. Crime, possession of a dream without a permit." Then the voice shifted and became deeper, more resonant, echoing with the cadence of the books it had been designed to simulate. "Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing." "It's reciting Poe," Pikes whispered, mesmerized. "The censor is reading the forbidden text. I must have crosswired the storage banks when I built the execution subroutine." The Garrett robot grabbed Stendahl's wrist. Its grip was terrifyingly strong. The strength of individual hydraulics disguised his flesh. "The Tarn," the robot said, his voice now a haunting blend of Garrett's bureaucracy and Poe's melancholy. "The Tarn is substandard. It does not meet the safety requirements for ghosts. Where is the tall man? The man of soot and October. He has the scythe. He is the carapace of the world. We must drain the abyss." "Let's go," Stendahl commanded, but he didn't pull away. He was fascinated. "Is this what happens, Pikes? When you destroy the books, do the ghosts just move into the machines? Is Garrett still in there, or is he just a hollow shell filled with the things he tried to burn?" "It's just a feedback loop," Pikes said, though his hand was trembling as he reached for the power switch at the base of the robot's skull. "It's just copper and glass, Tom. Don't make more of it than it is." "Is it?" Stendahl looked into the glass eye. "We spent our lives trying to protect the spirit of imagination from the machine of the state, and now the machine of the state is the only thing left that remembers the poems." The robot's chest hissed, a cloud of coolant vapor venting from the wound. It leaned closer to Stendahl, its face inches from him. "Stendahl," the machine whispered. It wasn't the investigator's voice anymore. It was a voice of pure, distilled sorrow. Is the house truly gone? Or is it just waiting for the next investigator? The house is gone, Stendahl said. Then the moral climate is absolute, the robot said, its eyes dimmed, the internal lights flickering like a dying candle. Without the shadow, there is no light. Without the monster, there is no man. Submit your imagination for recycling. With a final jagged spark, the Garrett thing went limp. Its hand released Stendahl's wrist and thudded back into the crate. The whirring of the gyroscopes wound down into a long, mournful cry, and then silence. Stendahl stood in the dark of the lava tube. The green emergency lights made the cavern look like the bottom of a sea. He looked at the dead machine and then at his own hands. He's right, isn't he? Stendahl said to the shadows. We killed the censors, but we used their own methods. We trapped them. We executed them. We built a machine to destroy them. Are we any different from the men who burned the books, Pikes? Or are we just the other side of the same old coin? Pikes didn't answer. He was busy covering the crate with a gray tarp, hiding the face of the investigator. We did what had to be done, Pikes said eventually. We saved the seeds. But what will grow from them? Stendahl asked, his voice echoing into the deep, unmapped tunnels of Mars. If the only thing that remembers the stories is a broken machine, what kind of world are we building here in the dark? He walked to the mouth of the cave and looked out at the Martian night. The stars were sharp and indifferent, millions of light years away from petty fires and dying books of men. Somewhere out there, the drones were still searching. Somewhere out there, the moral climate was still rising. But here, in the cold basalt of the throat of the planet, Stendahl felt a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the fear that they had brought the very thing they hated with them, that the machine was not outside but inside, waiting for the dark to let it out. Let's get the press ready, Stendahl said, his voice hardening. If the machines are the only ones who remember the words, then we must make more humans who can read. The cave was no longer just a lava tube. It had become a factory of ghosts. Deeper than the Blue Mountains, where the Martian crust was thick enough to swallow the prying electronic hum of the moral climate satellites, Stendahl and Pikes had built a sanctuary. It was a cathedral of shadow, lit only by the low orange glow of portable heaters that fought a losing battle against the encroaching frost of the Martian night. In the center of the cavern sat the press. It was a beautiful, archaic beast of iron and brass, salvaged in pieces from a forgotten basement in old London, and smuggled across space as replacement parts for a hydraulic press. It stood like a silent altar. Beside it were the trays of lead, thousands of tiny cold letters, each one a soldier in a war that Earth thought it had already won. It's too slow, Tom, Pike said. He was hunched over a tray, his thin fingers blackened with ink that smelled of linseed oil and graphite. We've been here for 3 months. We've managed to print 40 copies of The Willows and a dozen of the cast from Montiato. At this rate, the sun will go out before we restock a single shelf of your old library. Stendahl didn't look up from the press. He was turning the heavy iron crank. A rhythmic thrum-clack, thrum-clack. That was the only heartbeat in the cave knew. He watched as a fresh sheet of paper, thin, durable Martian vellum made from compressed lichen, was pressed against the ink pipe. We aren't restocking a library, Pikes, Stendahl said. His voice had changed in the months of darkness. It was no longer the sharp, manic edge of the man who had built the house of Usher. It was a low, steady rumble like the shifting of tectonic plates. We're creating a virus. A library is a stationary target. It can be found. It can be surrounded by men in white suits. It can be burned. He pulled the sheet from the press. The ink was wet and dark, the words sharp against the pale paper. I was sick unto death with that long agony. But a single page, Stendahl continued, a single book small enough to be hidden in a child's pocket, that is a ghost they can't catch. You don't need 50,000 books to change a world, Pikes. You only need one book that finds the right pair of eyes at the right time of night. Pikes sighed, rubbing his aching back. The moral climate is tightening, Tom. I picked up a radio burst from the new Syracuse colony yesterday. They've started a psychological sanitation in the primary schools. They're teaching the children that metaphors are a form of schizophrenia. They're giving them pills to suppress the visualizing centers of the brain. Stendahl stopped the press. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in from the corners of the cave where the library of dust stood. stacks of printed pages waiting to be bound. Then we must move fast, Stendahl said. We have the distribution points mapped, yes? The airlocks, Pikes nodded. The automated supply drones that run between the colonies. I figured out how to slip a packet into the maintenance hatches. When the drones dock for refueling, the packets will fall out. They'll look like trash, like discarded manuals, until someone picks them up. Stendahl walked to the back of the cave, where the Garrett thing still sat in its tarp-covered crate. He had kept it there, a silent witness to their labor. Occasionally, the robot would twitch, its logic gates sparking in the dark, whispering fragments of the laws it was built to uphold. They want to cure the children of imagination, Stendahl murmured, looking at the silent machine. They want to turn the human mind into a mirror that reflects nothing but the room it's in. But they forget that the mind isn't a mirror. It's an ocean. And even the calmest ocean has monsters in its depths. Like Kraken. He reached into a crate and pulled out a finished volume. It was tiny, barely 3 inches tall, bound in scrap leather from the helicopter seats. On the cover, Tyndall had hand-tooled a single image, a golden key. This is the first batch, Stendahl said. The introduction to the dark. I've included Poe's The Telltale Heart, Bradbury's The Foghorn, and a few poems by Yeats. No manifestos, no calls to rebellion, just stories. Why stories? Pikes asked. If we want to stop them, shouldn't we be printing instructions on how to dismantle their sensors? How to bypass the moral scanners? No, Stendahl said, his small dark smile touching his lips. Instructions are for hands. Stories are for the blood. If you tell a man how to break a machine, he might do it, but he'll still think like a man who works for the machine. But if you tell a man about a house that sinks into a tarn, if you tell him about a dinosaur that falls in love with a lighthouse, you change the way he sees the stars. You make the world too big for the censors to manage. He walked back to the press and picked up the ink roller. The ritual began again. Apply, roll, press, release. Apply, roll, press, release. The sound was a prayer. We're the burning men in reverse, Pikes, Stendahl said. On Earth, they use fire to create a void. Here on Mars, we are using the dust to fill it. Every book we send out is a spark. Eventually, the moral climate will find itself surrounded by 1,000 small fires, and they won't have enough water in all the Martian seas to put them out. The work continued into the small hours of the morning. Outside, the Martian wind howled against the blue mountains. A high, ethereal, haunting sound that Pikes had once said sounded like the ghosts of the Martians who had died here thousands of years ago. Do you think they're watching us? Pikes asked suddenly, looking toward the dark mouth of the lava tube. The Martians? The ones who used to live here? Stendahl paused, his hand on the iron crank. He looked into the depths of the cave, where the shadows seemed to shift and dance in the orange heater light. I think they'd approve, Stendahl said. They were a race of poets and architects. They built cities of glass and sang to the sand. They knew that a world without fantasy is just a graveyard with better plumbing. If they are watching, I think they're waiting for us to finish. Finish what? The transition, Stendahl said. We've spent centuries being humans who use machines to control the world. Maybe it's time we became humans who use stories to understand it. The Martians didn't die out because they lacked logic, Pikes. They died because their story ended. I'm just making sure ours has a few more chapters. He pressed the next sheet. Thrum, clack, thrum, clack. As the night wore on, the library of dust grew. Thousands of tiny pages, millions of forbidden words, all waiting to be scattered like seeds across the red sands. Stendahl's hands were stained so deeply with ink, he suspected they would never be clean again. And he didn't care. It was just the way he liked it. Ink was his new blood, the press, his new heart. In the corner, the Garrett robot suddenly whirred to life for a brief, flickering second. Its eyes glowed dull, a dying red. The climate, it stuttered, is changing. Changing. Yes, Stendahl whispered, turning the crank once more. It's getting a little more overcast. There's a storm of imagination coming, Garrett, and you didn't bring an umbrella. The robot's light failed. The cave returned to the steady rhythmic sound of the press, the sound of two men in a hole in the ground rebuilding a soul of a species, one tiny inked letter at a time. 10 years had passed since the House of Usher had vanished into the black waters of the Tarn. In the Martian colonies, the moral climate had become a permanent winter. The cities, New Syracuse, New Chicago, New London, were masterpieces of glass and terror, where the walls were white, the thoughts were transparent, and the laughter was as empty as the atmosphere. Tom Stendahl was an old man now, a creature of the deep places. His hair was the color of Martian frost, and his eyes, once burning with the fire of revenge, had cooled into the steady, watchful glow of a banked hearth. He stood in the shadows of a maintenance tunnel beneath the great plaza of New Syracuse, wearing the gray, nondescript coveralls of a thermal pipe technician. "Is it time?" a voice whispered from the darkness. Stendahl turned. Pikes emerged from the steaming of a venting valve. Pip himself had finally aged into a silhouette. He was a man made of wire and memory, his hands still stained with the permanent phantom ink of the printing press. "The bells are striking midnight," Stendahl said. "The logic shift is changing guards. If the children are going to move, they will move now." They climbed a rusty ladder, emerging into the cold blue air of a public park. In the center of the park stood a monument to the Great Erasure, a massive, featureless block of white marble dedicated to the death of deception. But tonight that park was not empty. From the shadows of the modular apartment blocks, figures began to emerge. They were small, children of the colonies, born into a world without fairy tales. Raised on a diet of statistics and sanitation, they moved with a strange gliding grace, their faces hidden behind masks. Stendahl felt his heart skip a beat. These were not the professional, expensive masks Pike had built for the House of Usher. These were handmade, jagged things. They were masks made of discarded ration tins, scrap plastic, Martian mud. There was a girl in a mask that looked like a long-eared rabbit, a boy with a face made of silver foil, twisted into the shape of a man with a tin heart. Another child wearing a cape made of gray industrial filters, pretending to be a ghost. They found them," Pikes whispered, his voice trembling in performer's awe. "The seeds. They found them." Stendahl watched as the children gathered at the base of the white marble monument. They didn't shout, they didn't protest. Instead, one by one, they pulled tiny, leather-bound books from their pockets. The Library of Dust that Stendahl and Pikes had spent a decade printing in the dark. A girl in the center, wearing a mask of a red-capped waif, opened her book and began to read. Her voice was small, but in the sterile silence of the city, it sounded like a trumpet blast. "Once upon a time..." The words hit the white walls of the plaza and bounced back, amplified by the architecture of the logic. "There was a path through a great dark forest." From the shadows of the surrounding buildings, the moral climate drones began to descend. They were sleek, blue-lit discs that hummed. They would sound like a swarm of angry hornets. Their spotlights swept the park, bleaching the children's handmade masks into pale, frightening visages. "Stay where you are," a voice boomed from the lead drone, a voice that was a perfect synthesized copy of the long-dead investigator Garrett. "You are in possession of non-functional data. Discard the artifacts and proceed to the sanitation station for rebalancing." The children didn't move. They stood their ground, their tiny books held high like shields. "Stendahl," Pikes hissed, grabbing his arm. "Tom, the peace enforcers are coming. We have to go. We've sealed it. It worked. Let's get back to the mountains." "No," Stendahl said, his voice ringing with a sudden youthful clarity. "The play isn't over, Pikes. It's just the intermission. Look! Look!" Out of the drones, one of the drones hovered inches from the girl in the red mask. Its mechanical claw reached out to seize the book. But before it could touch her, a man in a white moral climate uniform stepped out from the cordon of guards. He was a young man, a guard whose job was to ensure the purity of the park. He looked at the girl, he looked at the book. Then he did something that had not happened on Mars in 30 years. He reached into his own tunic and pulled out a matching tiny volume, a copy of The Fall of the House of Usher that had been left in a maintenance hatch 6 months ago. He didn't arrest the girl. He stood beside her. "The climate is changing," the guard said, and though he spoke to the drone, his eyes were on the stars. The drones faltered. Their logic processors, built on the assumption of total compliance, began to whine and click in a feedback loop of confusion. More guards arrived, but they stopped at the edge of the park. They saw the children, they saw the masks, and they heard the words of 1,000 forbidden stories being recited in a rising chorus. Once upon a time, get you, my pretty, curiouser and curiouser, off with their heads. Faith, trust, and pixie dust, all the best people. I think I can. Beware, I am fearless. Call me Ishmael, Goblin King, Remind me of the babe, fee, fi, fo, fum. Open sesame, no place like home, no place like home. Mirror, mirror on the wall, I'll huff and I'll puff. Some pig, humble, radiant. Ideas are weapons. Let the rumpus while rumpus start. Stendahl stepped out of the shadows, walking toward the center of the park. He felt the weight of the years fall away. He wasn't the romantic extremist anymore. He was just an old man watching his garden grow. He reached the monument. He looked up at the featureless white block, and with a piece of charcoal he'd carried from the ruins of his first library, he wrote a single name on that white marble. Edgar. The drones buzzed overhead. They were powerless. You cannot arrest a metaphor. You cannot incinerate a thought that has already taken root in a child's blood. It's a mask, Pikes, Stendahl called back to his friend. The last mask of the Red Planet. But this time the Red Death isn't a plague. It's the imagination. As the sun began to rise over the Martian horizon, a sun that looked for the first time in a century like a golden chariot instead of a nuclear furnace, the children began to dance. They danced around the white monument, their scrap metal masks glinting in the new light. They sang songs of Oz and Wonderland, of dragons and dandelions, of lighthouses that loved and houses that sank into tarns. Stendahl stood in the center of the world, a ghost among the living. He looked up at the sky, past the drones and the glass towers, toward the distant blue spark of Earth. Do you hear them, Garrett? Stendahl whispered to the wind. Do you hear the sound of the moral climate breaking? There was no answer from the drones, but the Martian wind picked up the children's voices and carried them across the dunes, into the tunnels, and through the airlocks of every white city on the planet. Stendahl turned to Pikes, who was now standing beside him, a look of pure theatrical joy in his face. What now, Tom? Pikes asked. The play is over. The curtain is up. Stendahl looked at the children, the new keepers of the flame. He felt a profound sepulchral peace. The house of Usher had fallen, but the foundation of the human soul had proven to be something stronger than stone. Now, Stendahl said, taking a deep breath of the thin, cold air that finally tasted like a story, now we go home. I think I'd like to read something new, something optimistic. The two men walked away from the plaza, disappearing into the morning mist of Mars. Behind them, the children continued to read, their voices a rising tide that would, in time, wash away the white cities and leave behind a world where the dark was not a danger, but a place where the stars could finally be seen. The last mask was over. The story of William Thomas Stendahl had reached its final page. But as the Martian dust settled on the white monument, the words written in charcoal remained, a small dark promise, in a world that was learning to dream again. The classroom in New Syracuse didn't have windows. It had visual optimization panels. They flickered with a steady, shadowless light that made everyone's skin look like the surface of curdled milk. Mara sat at her desk, a molded piece of white recycled plastic that felt like a surgical tray. She was 10 years old, which meant she was a stage 3 logical asset. Her teacher, a woman named Miss Miller, who smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and had eyes like gray marble, was currently lecturing on the dangers of ambiguous adjectives. A word should be a tool, Miss Miller said, her voice a flat, calibrated hum. A hammer drives a nail. A screwdriver turns a screw. A word should describe a function. To say a sunset is fiery is a medical error. A sunset is a light refraction event. To call it fiery suggests a hazard that does not exist. It creates a neurosis of the spirit. Young Mara looked down at her hands. She felt a strange cold itch in her chest. For as long as she could remember, the world had been a series of clear, clean facts. The sky was red because of iron oxide. The air was thin because of the low atmospheric pressure. The history of Earth was a long, messy fever that had finally been cured by the Great Fire. But then Mara had found the gasket. 2 weeks ago, while playing near the massive ventilator shaft in the sublevel of the playground, a small square object had tumbled out of a maintenance hatch. It was wrapped in heavy, oily plastic. Inside, she had not found a filter or a valve. She had found a tiny leather-bound object that smelled of things she had no names for. Old cellars, autumn leaves, and the salt of a sea she had never seen. She had hidden it inside her logical analysis tablet, and now as Miss Miller continued to drone on about the inefficiency of poetry, Mara slid the tiny book out. She opened it to a random page. Her eyes fell on a word she had been taught was a grade A linguistic narcotic. Yellow. In the world of near Syracuse, there was white, gray, and the dull, rusty red of the dust. But the word on the page wasn't just a color. It was a sensation. It spoke of yellow brick roads and golden apples. It described a world where things didn't just exist, they glowed. Mara. Miss Miller's voice cut through the air like a scalpel. Mara snapped the tablet shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. Your biometric sensor is showing an elevated pulse, Miss Miller said, stepping toward her. Are you experiencing a logic deficit? Do you need a balancing pill? No, Miss Miller, Mara said, her voice trembling. I was just calculating the erosion rates of the Blue Mountains. Miss Miller leaned down, her gray eyes searching Mara's face. The Blue Mountains are a restricted zone, Mara. They are a place of stagnant air and geological instability. We do not think about the mountains, Mara. We think about the city, Mara. The city is the answer to every question. Do you understand? Yes, Miss Miller. Good. Now proceed to the recreation hall. It's time for your pre-measured leisure period. Mara didn't go to the recreation hall. Instead, she slipped into the service tunnels, the veins of the city that Pikes and Stendahl had mapped out a decade prior. She ran until the hum of the city's logic centers faded into a low, distant throb. She sat in the dark of a maintenance crawl space and pulled out the tiny book again. This time, she didn't just look at the words. She tasted them. She read about a girl named Dorothy and a dog named Toto. She read about a cyclone that lifted a house into the sky, not a rational rocket-propelled house, but a house that flew on the wings of a whim. As she read, the tunnel changed. The cold gray pipes didn't look like plumbing anymore. It looked like the twisted trunks of ancient trees. The dim emergency lights weren't LEDs. They were the glowing eyes of forest creatures watching her from the brush. It's a story, she whispered, and the word felt like a spark in a room full of oxygen. It's not a report. It's a story. Suddenly a shadow fell across the page. Mara froze. A blue light began to pulse from the ceiling. A moral climate drone, its sensors whirring as it scanned her biometric signature. Unauthorized data detected, the drone boomed. Identify the artifact, Citizen Mara. The possession of imaginative stimulus is a violation of the Mental Hygiene Act. Mara clutched the book to her chest. For a moment, the old logic tried to take over. It's just paper. It's just carbon and ink. Hand it over, and the pulsing in your heart will stop. But then Mara thought of the yellow brick road. She thought of the house of Usher sinking into the tarn. She thought of the nevermore she had seen scribbled on wall in the sublevels. No, she said. The drone lowered itself, mechanical claws extending. Resistance is futile symptom of cognitive decay. Hand over the artifact. It's not an artifact. It's a key. And you're not an investigator. Miss Miller says a word must describe a function. You're just a tool for browning bread. You're a toaster with a loud voice and delusions of law. The drone's blue light flickered, turning a confused, static-filled purple. It spun in a tight, agitated circle, its internal cooling fans rising to a high, distressed whine as it searched its database for bread browning protocols. Its logic processors were not programmed for insults based on domestic appliances, and that second of mechanical confusion, Mara bolted. She didn't run toward the city center. She ran toward the atmospheric exit, the great gate that led out into the Martian wilderness. The air outside was thin and smelled of cold iron. Mara's respirator hissed as she scrambled over the jagged obsidian rocks at the base of the Blue Mountains. Behind her, the lights of New Syracuse looked like a cluster of cold white diamonds. Ahead of her was the dark. She reached the mouth of a cave, the very lava tube where the library of dust had been born. Who's there? A voice called out. It wasn't a synthesized voice. It was a voice that sounded like the wind blowing through a flute made of bone. Mara stepped into the cave. An old man sat there, his hair a wild halo of white frost. He was sitting at a table made of a rocket casing, and he was holding a tiny leather-bound book that matched hers. "I found it," Mara said, holding up her copy of Oz. "The drone tried to take it from me, but I told it..." She swallowed and lifted her chin. "I told it the truth, that it was a toaster with delusions of law." The old man, Stendahl, let out a laugh that sounded like the breaking of a long winter frost. a, a toaster. He shook his head, savoring it. "Oh, Joe would have loved that." "Pikes would have given you a medal, Mara." "Where is he?" Mara asked, looking into the shadows. "The man who makes the masks." Stendahl's smile faded into a gentle, melancholic peace. He's in the stories now, child. He decided to become a ghost before the moral climate could turn him into a statistic. He's in the wind. He's in the dust. He's in the very book you're holding." Stendahl stood up, his bones creaking like the house of Usher. He walked to the back of the cave and pulled a heavy tarp away. Mara gasped. It wasn't a machine. It was a forest. "Oh!" It wasn't just a collection of crates. It was a monument. In the center of the cavern, Stendahl had constructed a branching trellis of copper wire and salvaged rocket struts that reached toward the basalt ceiling. It was a tree, but its bark was made of leather bindings and its sap was permanent ink. Thousands of tiny books, tiny, medium, large, thousands, hung from the metallic limbs like heavy multicolored fruit. Each spine a carved grimace of ink. They were bound in peacock blue, sunset orange, midnight purple, shivering slightly in the draft of the lava tube like the leaves in a late October wind. "They think they've won," Stendahl said, gesturing to the city in the distance. "They think that because they've paved the ground, the seeds are dead. But look at you. You ran 10 miles through the dark because of a word. You defied a machine because of a girl in a silver foil mask." Tears ran from Stendahl's eyes as he reached out and took Mara's hand. His skin felt like old parchment, warm and dry. "The tetralogy is almost complete, Mara," Stendahl whispered. "Poe wrote The Fall. Bradbury wrote The Revenge. I wrote The Survival. But your generation, you have to write The Return. And reading is fundamental to that, Mara." "But how?" Mara asked. Stendahl handed her a fresh roll of vellum and a pen filled with dark permanent ink. "Go back. Take the books. Hide them in the ventilators. Hide them in the lunch boxes. Hide them in the very hearts of logic. When they ask you what you're doing, tell them you're just a thermal pipe technician. And then, Stendahl said, looking out at the sands of Mars as the twin moons began their nightly dance. Then wait for the autumn. The autumn always comes back, Mara. No matter how much concrete they use, the leaves always find a way to turn brown and fall." Mara took the pen and paper. She looked at the old man who seemed to be fading into the shadows of the cave, becoming a part of the library itself. "Will I see you again?" "In the pages," Stendahl said. "I'll be the one building the house by the tarn. And Pikes will be the one in the mask, waiting behind the door to give you a fright." Mara turned and began the long walk back toward the white lights of the city. But she wasn't the same girl who had sat at the molded plastic desk. She was a carrier of a virus. She was a ghost in the making. As Mara reached the city gates, she looked back one last time. The blue mountains were silent, but through that ancient October hush of the red dunes, she thought she heard the faint, distant sound of a mechanical bat flapping its wings. Or perhaps it was something else. A great, tattered kite made of carnival posters and old newsprint, tugging at an invisible string, carrying the laughter of 8 boys and a tall, soot-stained man across the red sands. Mara smiled, tucked the yellow brick road into her pocket, and walked back into the logic center to start the end of the world. And just like the end of the world, that's the end of our story. Woo. So then, I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was really long, and I'm really, really honored that you guys stuck with us for it. Again, of course, it'll be up on YouTube if you want to hear it or you want somebody else to hear it or something like that. So, thanks, guys. We had an amazingly fun time writing it and a super fun time being here with you tonight.